"Sarah, we need help in room 426. He's coding." Sarah Connor's hands shook as she sprinted down the hospital hallway, the overhead lights blurring into streaks. The adrenaline hit her system like a freight train. Not another one. Not today. She burst through the door to find a team already surrounding the bed, their movements frantic but practiced. The patient was a gaunt, older man, gray hair wild against the pillow, his body convulsing as the monitor screamed its warning. He wasn't supposed to crash for days, a resident muttered, preparing the defibrillator. Sarah pushed her way to the bedside, scanning the chart. John Whitman, 76, pancreatic cancer, DNR order pending but not yet signed. "Wait," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Has anyone checked his medication?" The resident shot her an irritated glance. "We don't have time." Sarah grabbed the IV bag, her eyes widening. "This is marked for room 428. He's having an allergic reaction, not cardiac arrest." The room froze. Sarah ripped the IV out with practiced precision, grabbed the emergency kit, and plunged the epinephrine into his thigh. For 3 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. Then John Whitman's eyes snapped open, filling with confusion, fear, and life. What Sarah didn't know in that moment. This split-second decision would catapult her from her ordinary life into something that felt ripped from a dream or a nightmare. And it would all begin with a private jet waiting on a small airstrip just hours later. But first, she had to survive her shift. 2 weeks earlier, Sarah had been sleepwalking through her life. 32 years old, divorced for 3 years, and trapped in the same nursing job she'd had since graduating. Her small apartment in Boston felt as empty as her social calendar. 12-hour shifts are killing me, she told her friend Mia over sad microwave dinners in the break room. I haven't been on a date in 6 months. Mia rolled her eyes. At least you don't have 3 kids and a husband who thinks the dishwasher is advanced alien technology. Sarah smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. She'd once wanted that life, the chaos, the fullness. Now she just felt numb. You need a vacation, Mia said, poking Sarah's arm. Somewhere tropical with cabana boys. On my salary. I'll settle for a weekend where I don't smell like disinfectant. Sarah's phone buzzed. Her mother again, probably asking when she was coming home to Iowa. The small town she'd escaped 10 years ago still had its hooks in her. She silenced the call. The head nurse appeared in the doorway. "Connor, you've got a new admission. Room 426. And that's how Sarah met John Whitman for the first time. Not during his near-death experience, but during a routine admission for what everyone thought would be his final stay. Terminal pancreatic cancer, the doctor told her outside the room. Maybe a week, probably less. Sarah nodded, used to the clinical detachment. But when she entered room 426, something changed. John Whitman didn't look like he was dying. Despite his frail body, his eyes were sharp, alert, taking in everything. He wore an expensive watch that looked too heavy for his thin wrist. "Let me guess," he said, his voice surprisingly strong. "You're here to poke me with more needles." Sarah found herself smiling genuinely for the first time that day. "Eventually. But first I thought we might talk about something more interesting than your vain quality." John laughed, then winced. "Careful, nurse. Making a dying man laugh might speed up the process." As Sarah checked his vitals, they fell into easy conversation. Unlike most patients, John asked about her, not just pleasantries but real questions. "Why nursing?" he asked. Sarah paused. "I wanted to help people in their worst moments." "And has it been everything you hoped?" The question hit something raw inside her. "It was, for a long time." John nodded, understanding in his eyes. "The trouble with dreams is they can trap you as easily as lift you up." Before Sarah could respond, a commotion erupted outside. A tall woman with a stern face entered, flanked by what could only be described as security personnel. "Dad," the woman said, ignoring Sarah completely. "I came as soon as I heard." The warmth in John's face dimmed. "Catherine, you didn't need to cut your trip short." Catherine Whitman's posture was rigid, her designer clothes immaculate. "Of course I did. The board is in chaos. Everyone's asking questions. John sighed. The company will survive without me. That's not, Catherine caught herself, finally acknowledging Sarah's presence. We need privacy. Sarah nodded and left, but not before catching John's apologetic glance. At the nurse's station, curiosity got the better of her. Sarah pulled up John's file on the computer. John Whitman, founder and CEO of Whitman Innovations. Sarah's eyes widened. Whitman Innovations was one of the largest tech companies in the world. She'd had no idea she was treating a billionaire. Don't waste your time, a fellow nurse said, noticing her screen. His daughter's already complained about 3 nurses. She'll have you replaced by morning. But the next day, when Sarah arrived for her shift, she found a note requesting her specifically as John's primary nurse. Catherine Whitman was waiting in the hallway. My father seems to like you, she said, as if this were a confusing development. I want him comfortable in his final days. Something in her tone bothered Sarah, but she nodded professionally. I'll do my best. Over the next 5 days, Sarah spent more time with John than any other patient. He told her stories about building his company from nothing, about his late wife who died 20 years earlier, about his disappointments and triumphs. Catherine was always brilliant, he told Sarah. But somewhere along the way, she forgot there's more to life than the next quarterly report. You never remarried? Sarah asked. John twisted the wedding band he still wore. Never found anyone who made me feel alive the way Elizabeth did. His eyes grew distant. I've made so many mistakes, Sarah. Worked too much. Trusted the wrong people. There's still time to fix things, Sarah said gently. John smiled sadly. Some things can't be fixed. On the 6th day, John's condition deteriorated rapidly. The doctors increased his pain medication, and he drifted in and out of consciousness. Catherine visited only briefly, spending most of her time in hushed phone conversations outside his room. On the morning of the 7th day, the day of the code, Sarah arrived to find 2 unfamiliar men in expensive suits speaking with Catherine in the hallway. It has to be today, one said urgently, before Catherine silenced him as Sarah approached. Nurse, she said curtly, my father was asking for you. Inside, John was awake but groggy from the medications. Sarah, he said weakly, I wanted to thank you. I'm just doing my job, Mr. Whitman. He shook his head. No, you listened. You saw me, not just another dying old man. He tried to sit up. There's something I need to tell you. But a coughing fit overtook him, and Sarah helped him take small sips of water. You should rest, she said. We can talk later. John grabbed her wrist with surprising strength. There might not be a later. Sarah, you need to know. The door opened and Catherine entered, her expression tense. Dad, the lawyers are here. We need to discuss the final changes to your will. John's face hardened. Not now, Catherine. It can't wait, Catherine insisted. The papers need to be signed today. John looked at Sarah. I need a moment with my daughter. Sarah left, but the tension in the room followed her. At the nurse's station, she found the 2 suits waiting. Nurse Connor, the older one, asked, a word. Before she could answer, her supervisor called her away to another patient. When she returned an hour later, the suits were gone, and a different nurse was administering John's medication. They switched his rooms, the nurse explained. 426 had some equipment issues. A knot formed in Sarah's stomach. Something felt wrong. 3 hours later, the code was called for room 426, and Sarah's world turned upside down. After saving John Whitman's life, Sarah found herself pulled into an administrative office. The hospital director and risk manager were waiting. Ms. Connor, the director began, we need to discuss what happened in Mr. Whitman's room. Sarah stood her ground. Someone nearly killed him with the wrong medication. The risk manager cleared his throat. There will be an investigation, of course, but Ms. Whitman has concerns about your involvement. My involvement? I saved his life. She suggests you may have been the one who switched the medication, the director said carefully. She claims you've grown, inappropriately attached to her father. Sarah couldn't believe what she was hearing. That's ridiculous. Check the logs, check the... We're looking into everything, the risk manager interrupted. Until then, you're suspended with pay. You can't do this, Sarah protested. We can and we have, the director said firmly. Please surrender your badge. In a daze, Sarah cleaned out her locker. As she left the hospital, she saw Catherine Whitman watching from a window, her expression unreadable. Sarah drove home, her mind racing. Why would Catherine accuse her? What was happening in that room before the code? What had John been trying to tell her? She was so distracted she almost missed the black SUV parked outside her apartment building. As she parked, a man stepped out, one of the suits from the hospital. Ms. Connor, he called, I need to speak with you urgently. Sarah's heart pounded. Who are you? James Morrison, I'm John Whitman's personal attorney. He looked around nervously. We can't talk here, you're in danger. What are you talking about? John suspected someone was trying to kill him. That's why he had me change his will last week. Morrison lowered his voice. He named you in it. Sarah felt like the ground was shifting beneath her feet. That's impossible. I barely know him. He trusted you, and now Catherine knows. Morrison handed her a small envelope. There's a private airfield 30 miles north. Be there at 8 p.m. sharp. Someone will meet you. This is insane, Sarah protested. I can't just. If you stay, they'll find a way to blame John's accident on you. Your career will be over, or worse. Morrison's eyes were deadly serious. John knew what his daughter was capable of. Before Sarah could respond, Morrison was back in the SUV, pulling away. Inside her apartment, Sarah paced frantically. This couldn't be happening. She opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a first-class ticket to Zurich, Switzerland, and a handwritten note. Sarah, if you're reading this, I didn't survive. Trust no one except James and Elise. What I built was meant to help people, not destroy them. The truth is in the lighthouse where Elizabeth and I spent our first anniversary. You'll understand when you get there. I'm sorry to drag you into this. John. Sarah sat heavily on her couch, the note clutched in her hand. This was madness. She should call the police, explain everything. But what if Morrison was right? What if she was being set up? Her phone rang, displaying the hospital's number. Sarah hesitated, then answered. Ms. Connor, a cold voice said. This is Detective Phillips. I need you to come down to the station immediately to answer some questions about John Whitman's death. Sarah's blood froze. Death? He was alive when I left. Mr. Whitman passed away an hour ago, under suspicious circumstances. The phone slipped from Sarah's fingers. John was dead, and somehow she was a suspect. She had 3 hours until the plane was scheduled to leave. 3 hours to decide if she would run or stay and fight. Sarah looked around her apartment, at the life she'd built that suddenly felt like a prison. The framed nursing diploma, the photos of friends who drifted away, the divorce papers in the bottom drawer of her desk. She thought of John Whitman's eyes when he told her about his regrets, about working too much, about the dreams that had trapped him. Sarah made her decision. 90 minutes later, she was in a taxi heading north, a small bag packed with essentials, her heart pounding in her chest. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the highway. Where exactly am I taking you? The driver asked, eyeing her in the rearview mirror. Sarah clutched the address Morrison had given her. Somewhere I can start over. As the taxi turned onto a narrow road leading to the airfield, Sarah saw flashing lights ahead. Police cars blocked the entrance. Looks like trouble, the driver said, slowing down. You still want to go in? Sarah's throat tightened. They'd found her. It was over before it began. But as they approached, she realized the police weren't stopping cars. They were directing traffic around an accident. A black SUV had crashed into a ditch. Morrison's SUV. Sarah told the driver to keep going, ducking down in her seat as they passed the wreckage. Through the window, she saw paramedics loading a body into an ambulance. The taxi continued to the small terminal. Sarah paid in cash and walked inside, her legs unsteady. The terminal was nearly empty. A single attendant stood behind a counter. I'm supposed to meet someone, Sarah said, her voice barely audible. The attendant nodded. Through those doors, Miss Connor, they're waiting for you. Sarah pushed through the doors and stepped onto the tarmac. The night air was cool against her face, and there, gleaming under the runway lights, was a sleek private jet. A woman in a crisp uniform stood at the foot of the boarding stairs. "Ms. Connor, I'm Elise. John sent me." Sarah hesitated, looking back at the terminal, then at the distant flashing lights where Morrison's car had crashed. "I don't understand any of this," Sarah admitted. "Why me? Why did he trust me?" Elise's expression softened. "John was a good judge of character. He said you reminded him of Elizabeth." She gestured to the jet. "I can explain everything on the way, but we need to leave now." Sarah took a deep breath and stepped forward, climbing the stairs into a world she never imagined would be open to her. As the jet door closed behind her, she caught a glimpse of another black SUV speeding toward the airfield. "We have company," Elise said calmly, signaling to the pilot. "Buckle up, Ms. Connor, it's going to be a bumpy start." The engines roared to life as Sarah sank into a leather seat, wondering what secrets waited for her in a lighthouse halfway across the world, and what John Whitman had really died for. The jet began to move, picking up speed down the runway. Sarah watched the lights of her old life recede through the window, her future suddenly as vast and unknown as the darkening sky. What she didn't know was that, in her haste to leave, she'd missed the most important clue of all, one that had been right in front of her from the beginning, one that would make the difference between exposing the truth and becoming another victim. And as the private jet lifted into the night sky, carrying her away from everything she'd ever known, Sarah Connor had no idea that her journey had only just begun, or that the danger following her was far closer than she realized. Elise handed her a glass of water. "John left something for you, something Catherine would kill to get her hands on." "What?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. Elise reached into her jacket and pulled out a small, worn notebook. "The future," she said simply, "and the key to understanding why he really chose you." As Sarah took the notebook, the jet banked sharply to avoid a thunderstorm, the cabin lights flickering momentarily in the darkness, much like the uncertain path now stretching before her. "There's something you should know about John," Elise said, her voice dropping. "He wasn't just a tech billionaire." Sarah opened the notebook, her eyes widening at the first page. "Project Phoenix, Human Regeneration Protocol." Below it was a detailed drawing of a cellular structure, unlike anything Sarah had ever seen, along with equations and notes in John's handwriting. And at the bottom of the page, a single sentence that made Sarah's blood run cold. "The treatment works, but the side effects are worse than death itself." The jet continued its ascent, pushing through storm clouds toward clearer skies as Sarah turned the page, unknowingly embarking on a journey that would challenge everything she thought she knew about life, death, and the dangerous space in between. "John didn't die of cancer," Elise said, watching Sarah's reaction carefully. "He was poisoned, and the same people who killed him think you know his secret." Sarah looked up from the notebook, her nurse's mind already connecting dots she hadn't seen before. "The allergic reaction was no accident," Elise finished for her. "It was the first attempt." Lightning flashed outside the window, illuminating the cabin in harsh, white light. In that brief moment, Sarah noticed something odd about Elise's wrist, a small scar identical to the one John Whitman had. Before she could question it, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ms. Reese, we have a situation. Radar is showing an unauthorized aircraft pursuing our flight path." Elise's expression hardened. "They found us faster than I expected." She reached under her seat and pulled out what looked like a satellite phone. "Time for Plan B." Sarah clutched the notebook tighter, a realization dawning on her. She wasn't running away from danger. She was heading straight into its heart. And somehow, she knew that what waited in that lighthouse would change not just her life, but potentially the world itself. The jet accelerated, pushing her back into her seat as they raced through the night sky, pursued by shadows from a powerful family empire she was only beginning to understand, and secrets a dying man had entrusted to a nurse who had simply shown him kindness in his final days. Or so she thought. The jet lurched violently to the right. Sarah gripped the armrests, her knuckles white as the notebook slid across her lap. "We need to lose them," Elise said, speaking urgently into the satellite phone. "Execute Blackbird protocol." The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. "Hang on, this might get rough." Sarah's stomach dropped as the plane suddenly dived, then banked sharply left. Through the window she caught a glimpse of another aircraft, sleek, black, and much too close. "Who are they?" Sarah asked, struggling to keep her voice steady. Elise's eyes never left the window. "Officially, they don't exist. Unofficially, they work for a division of Whitman Innovations that Catherine built without her father's knowledge." She paused. "Project Lazarus." "The opposite of death," Sarah whispered, remembering her medical terminology. "Exactly." Elise finally turned to face her. "John discovered what Catherine was doing 6 months ago. That's when he started keeping the notebook." Another violent maneuver sent Sarah's water glass flying across the cabin. The pilot was attempting to shake their pursuer, diving through clouds to obscure their path. "I don't understand," Sarah said, clutching the notebook tighter. "What does any of this have to do with me?" Elise's expression softened. "John chose you because you were the only one who saw him as a person, not an asset." She leaned closer. "But there's another reason. Check your left wrist." Confused, Sarah pushed up her sleeve. There, just below her palm, was a small birthmark, a crescent shape she'd had since childhood. "Now look at the last page of the notebook." Sarah flipped to the back. Drawn in careful detail was the same crescent shape, labeled, "Genetic marker, Phoenix carrier." Her blood ran cold. "What is this?" "John didn't pick you randomly, Sarah. He'd been monitoring you for years." Before Sarah could process this revelation, the plane jerked again. The pilot's voice came through, tense but controlled. "We've lost them in the cloud cover. New flight plan activated." Elise checked her watch. "We're diverting to a private airstrip in Iceland. From there, we'll take a smaller plane to the final destination." "Not Switzerland." That was never the real plan, just a diversion if the flight manifest was compromised. Elise studied Sarah carefully. "Are you sure you want to continue? Once we land, there's no going back." Sarah thought of her empty apartment, her suspended job, the police who likely thought she was involved in John Whitman's death. What choice did she have? But more than that, she thought of John's eyes, the way they'd lit up when he spoke of his late wife, the way they dimmed when his daughter entered the room. He'd trusted her with something important, something worth dying for. "I want to know the truth," Sarah said firmly. Elise nodded. "Then you should read the notebook, all of it, before we land." As the jet stabilized, Sarah opened to the first page again and began to read. John's handwriting filled the margins, growing more hurried and desperate with each page. The scientific terms were complex, but Sarah's medical background helped her grasp the core concept. John had discovered a genetic mutation in a small percentage of the population, carriers of what he called the Phoenix gene. These carriers had cellular regeneration capabilities far beyond normal humans. With the right trigger, their cells could theoretically repair almost any damage, even reverse aging itself. "My God," Sarah murmured, turning pages faster. "He found the fountain of youth." "More like he found the key," Elise corrected. "The carriers are the key, people like you." Sarah looked up sharply. "Me. Your birthmark is just one identifier. John had been sampling DNA from potential carriers for decades. You came up as a match 5 years ago." "That's impossible. I never gave." Sarah stopped, suddenly remembering. "The medical study in nursing school, they paid students for blood samples." Elise nodded. Whitman Innovations funded thousands of medical studies across the country, hunting for carriers. Sarah continued reading. According to John's notes, he'd successfully developed a serum that could activate the regenerative properties in carriers, Project Phoenix. But the notes grew darker as the pages went on. Test subject 14 showed complete cellular regeneration, then rapid degradation. Deceased within 72 hours. Catherine insists we continue human trials despite the risks. says the military applications alone could fund the company for decades. This was never my intention. Sarah looked up, horrified. They were experimenting on people. Not just any people, Elise said grimly. Carriers like you. The realization hit Sarah like a physical blow. That's why he put me in his will, to warn me. Partly, but also to protect you. Elise reached for the notebook, turned to page 47. Sarah found the page, which contained a single paragraph. The Phoenix serum works only with fresh carrier DNA as a catalyst. Without it, the regeneration becomes unstable. Catherine knows this. I fear what she'll do when I'm gone. Sarah must reach the lighthouse. It's the only place the formula will be safe. She would have harvested my DNA, Sarah whispered, understanding flooding through her. That's why she tried to frame me for John's death, so she could get me into custody. And once you disappeared into the system, no one would question what happened to you. The jet hit turbulence, shuddering as they passed through another storm front. Sarah clutched the notebook, her mind racing. There's still something I don't understand. Why did John's medication get switched? If Catherine wanted the formula, John was dying too slowly, Elise said. The board meeting to transfer power was scheduled for next week. Catherine needed him gone immediately. Sarah shook her head, processing the layers of betrayal. How do you know all this? Elise rolled up her sleeve, revealing the scar Sarah had glimpsed earlier. Because I was test subject 1, the only survivor of the early trials. Sarah stared at the woman across from her, seeing her clearly for the first time. Behind the professional demeanor, Elise's eyes held the same quality she'd noticed in John's, a weariness that seemed to reach beyond normal human experience. How old are you? Sarah asked quietly. Physically, around 35. Elise smiled thinly. Actually, I stopped counting after 70. The intercom crackled. Beginning descent to Reykjavik, secure all items. Sarah fastened her seatbelt mechanically, her mind still reeling from Elise's revelation. As the plane dipped below the clouds, she could see the rugged Icelandic landscape below, illuminated by the first hints of dawn. What happens now? Sarah asked. Now we get you to the lighthouse, before Catherine's people find us. And then, Elise's expression was unreadable. Then you make a choice. The small airstrip outside Reykjavik was deserted except for a waiting helicopter. Sarah and Elise hurried across the tarmac, the cold wind whipping at their faces. No time for rest, Elise shouted over the noise of the rotors. Catherine's reach extends everywhere. As if to confirm her words, Sarah spotted a black SUV turning onto the distant access road. They climbed into the helicopter, which lifted off just as the SUV screeched to a halt on the tarmac. Sarah caught a glimpse of men in tactical gear pouring out, weapons drawn. Too late, Elise said with grim satisfaction as the helicopter banked and sped away. For the next hour, they flew over Iceland's dramatic landscape, volcanoes, glaciers, and finally the rugged coastline. The helicopter began to descend toward a tiny island with a single structure perched on its rocky shore. The lighthouse. It looked ancient, its stone walls weathered by decades of storms. As they landed on a small pad near the base, Sarah noticed modern security features incongruously embedded in the old structure: cameras, reinforced doors, a keypad entry system. John converted it 20 years ago, Elise explained as they hurried inside. After Elizabeth died, it was their special place. The interior was a stark contrast to the exterior, sleek, modern, filled with advanced technology. But most striking was the central chamber, which housed a state-of-the-art laboratory. This is where he perfected the formula, Elise said, activating systems with practiced ease, and where he discovered the fatal flaw, the side effects mentioned in the notebook. Elise nodded grimly. Regeneration comes at a cost. The Phoenix process doesn't just repair cells, it fundamentally alters consciousness. She paused. The subjects began experiencing memories that weren't their own, past lives we thought at first. But they weren't past lives, Sarah guessed, the medical implications becoming clearer. No, they were genetic memories, experiences encoded in DNA itself, passed down through generations of carriers. Elise's voice grew soft. Most human minds can't handle it. The psychological breakdown is catastrophic. But you survived. Barely, and I'm not whole. Elise tapped her temple. There are days I don't know which memories are mine and which belong to ancestors centuries dead. Sarah absorbed this information, trying to make sense of it all. So John wanted to protect the formula. And destroy it, Elise interrupted. Once he understood the full implications, he realized it could never be used safely. But Catherine saw only the potential profits, a treatment that could extend life indefinitely, at least for the wealthy who could afford it. Even if it drove them insane. Catherine believes that's a manageable side effect, especially for military applications. Elise's expression darkened. Imagine soldiers who can regenerate from almost any injury, who don't fear death because they've already lived 1,000 lives in their minds. Sarah shuddered at the thought. She moved deeper into the lab, examining the equipment. On a central table sat a secured case. Is that the last remaining sample of the Phoenix serum? Elise confirmed. And the complete formula. Why didn't John destroy it himself? He tried, but the formula has a biological lock. It can only be deactivated by fresh carrier DNA combined with the original creator's genetic key. Elise looked at Sarah meaningfully. He needed both your blood and his own, but he was too sick to travel here. So I'm the key, Sarah said slowly. That's why he put me in his will. He knew I'd end up here. Yes, but there's something else. Elise hesitated. The serum does more than regenerate cells. In its pure form, with the right catalyst, it can transfer consciousness between carriers. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Transfer consciousness, you mean? John's consciousness could theoretically survive in another carrier's body. The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. He wanted to use me as a vessel, to cheat death. No, Elise said firmly. He explicitly rejected that option. Catherine was the one who wanted to force the transfer, to keep his genius working for the company indefinitely. That's why he had to get you away from her. Before Sarah could process this, an alarm blared through the facility. Elise rushed to a security monitor. They found us, faster than I expected. The screen showed a helicopter approaching. We have minutes at most. What do we do? Elise moved with sudden purpose, retrieving a medical kit from a cabinet. We destroy the serum, now. She prepared a syringe and looked at Sarah expectantly. I need your blood, combined with the sample of John's I've preserved. Sarah hesitated only briefly before rolling up her sleeve. As Elise drew her blood, another alarm sounded, proximity sensors detecting intruders on the island. They're landing, Elise said, working quickly to combine Sarah's blood with another vial, presumably John's, and the serum itself. The mixture began to glow with an unearthly blue light. Is it working? Sarah asked. Yes, the destabilization has begun. Elise placed the vial in a containment unit. In 10 minutes, the formula will be unrecoverable. The sound of gunfire erupted outside. Someone was trying to breach the lighthouse's defenses. We need to leave, Sarah urged, moving toward a back exit she'd spotted earlier. But Elise didn't move. There's something I haven't told you, Sarah. Something in her tone made Sarah stop. What? John didn't just choose you because you're a carrier. Elise's eyes filled with unexpected tears. He chose you because you're Elizabeth's granddaughter. The world seemed to tilt beneath Sarah's feet. What? That's impossible. My grandparents died before I was born. Your mother was adopted as an infant. Her birth mother was Elizabeth Whitman, John's wife. No, Sarah shook her head in denial. That would make John. Your grandfather, Elise's voice softened. He searched for you for years, found you in nursing school, watched you from afar. He was so proud of you, Sarah. The revelation struck Sarah with the force of physical pain. All those conversations in the hospital room, the way John had looked at her with such warmth, such familiarity. It hadn't been the ramblings of a dying man. It had been a grandfather, finally connecting with the granddaughter he'd never known. "Why didn't he tell me?" Sarah whispered. "He was going to, that day in the hospital before Catherine interrupted, but then things moved too quickly." Elise glanced anxiously at the security monitor, which showed armed figures moving toward the lighthouse. "There's no time to explain everything now. You need to." The lighthouse shuddered as something struck the outer door. They were trying to blow their way in. "Take this." Elise pressed a small device into Sarah's hand. "It's a beacon. Activate it when you're safely away from here. My people will find you." "Your people? Who are you really?" Elise smiled sadly. "Someone who made a promise to an old friend." She pushed Sarah toward a concealed door at the back of the lab. "There's a boat docked on the far side. Take it and don't look back." "What about you?" "I'll hold them off." Elise checked her watch. "The serum needs 8 more minutes to fully destabilize. I can give you that time." Sarah hesitated. "Come with me." "I can't." Elise's eyes held a strange acceptance. "The serum that keeps me alive is failing, has been for years. This was always my last mission." Another explosion rocked the lighthouse. The outer door wouldn't hold much longer. "Go, Sarah, live, find others like you. Protect them from people like Catherine." Tears stinging her eyes, Sarah grabbed the notebook and hurried through the concealed door. It led to a narrow staircase that wound down through the core of the lighthouse, eventually opening onto a small, rocky cove where a sleek motorboat was moored. As she untied the boat, Sarah heard gunfire echoing from above. She looked back at the lighthouse, silhouetted against the brightening sky, and said a silent prayer for Elise. The boat's engine roared to life, and Sarah steered away from the island, heading toward the open sea. Behind her, the lighthouse stood defiant against the dawn, a symbol of both beginning and end. She had gone perhaps half a mile when a massive explosion tore through the morning silence. Sarah turned to see the top of the lighthouse engulfed in flames, smoke billowing into the sky. The serum was destroyed. Elise was gone, and Catherine's dream of immortality had died with them. Or so Sarah thought. As she wiped tears from her eyes, focusing on the horizon, she didn't notice the small tracking device attached to the boat's underside, silently broadcasting her location to a satellite orbiting thousands of miles above. 3 months later, Sarah sat in a cafe in a small coastal town in Norway, her appearance subtly altered, hair darker, cut in a different style, colored contacts changing her eye color. The waitress knew her as Anna, a Canadian writer working on a novel. No one knew she was Sarah Connor, still wanted for questioning in the death of John Whitman. No one knew she carried in her cells the key to a technology that could change humanity forever. She sipped her coffee, watching fishing boats return to the harbor as evening approached. The notebook sat on the table before her, its pages now committed to memory. She'd spent weeks deciphering John's notes, understanding the true nature of carriers like herself. According to John's research, carriers appeared throughout human history, individuals with extraordinary recovery abilities, often living well beyond normal lifespans. Joan of Arc, Rasputin, countless unnamed others who survived what should have killed them. The Phoenix gene wasn't a mutation. It was an ancient part of human DNA, dormant in most people but active in a select few. John hadn't created anything new. He'd simply found a way to amplify what was already there. Sarah flipped to the last page, where she'd added her own notes. After the explosion, she'd activated Elise's beacon as instructed. Within hours, a fishing boat had coincidentally found her drifting. The captain had given her passage to the mainland, no questions asked, along with a package containing new identification, money, and an encrypted phone. Occasionally, the phone would receive a message, coordinates, a name, sometimes a warning, always signed with the same symbol, a phoenix rising from ashes. Elise's people, or perhaps John's. Sarah still wasn't sure who she was working with, only that they shared a common enemy in Catherine Whitman and her vision for Project Lazarus. As if summoned by her thoughts, the phone vibrated. A new message. Catherine survived, rebuilding team. New carrier identified in Prague, coordinates attached, urgent. Sarah's heart sank. She'd hoped the destruction of the formula would end this. But Catherine was as resilient as the regeneration technology she sought to control. The waitress appeared at her table. "More coffee?" "No, thank you," Sarah smiled, already calculating the fastest route to Prague. "Just the check. I'm afraid I need to leave tonight." As the waitress walked away, Sarah noticed a man sitting at a corner table, pretending to read a newspaper while watching her. She'd seen him before, 3 days ago at the market. They'd found her again. Sarah calmly gathered her belongings and left money on the table. As she walked out of the cafe, she placed a call on the encrypted phone. "It's me," she said quietly. "I need extraction, and we have another carrier to find." The voice that answered was familiar, impossibly, heartbreakingly familiar. "A car is already on the way, Sarah." A pause. "You've done well." Sarah stopped in her tracks, blood rushing in her ears. "John." The line was silent for a moment. Then, in a manner of speaking, Elise made a choice in her final moments. Sarah leaned against a wall, struggling to process what she was hearing. The consciousness transfer, she used it. Yes, to preserve what John knew, what he could still do to help. The voice, John's voice coming from Elise's consciousness, softened. "She wanted you to know she didn't suffer." Tears blurred Sarah's vision. All these months she'd been working with John's consciousness preserved in Elise's dying body. The ultimate sacrifice, the ultimate gift. "The car will be at the North Dock in 10 minutes, the voice continued. "We'll explain everything when you're safe." Sarah ended the call, composing herself before continuing down the street. The man from the cafe was following at a discreet distance. She needed to lose him before reaching the dock. As she turned a corner into a narrow alley, Sarah felt a strange sensation, a warmth spreading through her body, starting from the crescent birthmark on her wrist. For a split second, her vision blurred, replaced by images she'd never seen before. A young woman laughing on a beach. The same lighthouse, decades younger. John Whitman holding a baby. Genetic memories, surfacing for the first time. Sarah gasped, bracing herself against a wall until the sensation passed. This was what Elise had warned about, the consciousness-altering effects of the Phoenix gene when activated. But Sarah hadn't taken the serum, which meant her gene was activating naturally, evolving. She straightened, a new determination flowing through her. She wasn't just running from Catherine anymore. She was racing to find others like herself, to protect them from those who would exploit their gifts. As she emerged from the alley onto the harbor front, Sarah caught sight of the waiting car, and the team of men converging on it from multiple directions. Catherine's people had anticipated the extraction. Sarah changed direction, melting into a group of tourists boarding a sightseeing boat. From her new vantage point, she watched Catherine's men surround the empty car, oblivious to their target casually drifting away on the evening tide. The boat pulled away from the dock, offering a panoramic view of the picturesque town, a place Sarah had almost begun to think of as home. Now it was just another stop on an endless journey. Her phone vibrated with another message. "Plan B initiated. Meet at secondary location." Sarah smiled faintly. She was getting better at this game of cat and mouse. And with each passing day, with each new memory surfacing from her genetic code, she was becoming something more than she had been. Not just Sarah Connor, nurse from Boston. Not just the granddaughter of John Whitman, but a guardian of a secret written in her very cells. A secret that could heal the world or destroy it, depending on whose hands controlled it. As the boat sailed into the open water, Sarah looked to the horizon, where the setting sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and reds, like a phoenix burning. She thought of John, of Elise, of the choice they'd made and the trust they'd placed in her. She thought of the other carriers out there, unaware of what made them special, or the danger they were in. And she made a silent promise to the grandfather she'd barely known. The phoenix would rise again, but this time on her terms. With one last look at the town disappearing behind her, Sarah turned toward her future, toward Prague, toward the next carrier, toward a destiny she never could have imagined when she walked into room 426 to meet a dying billionaire who saw in her not just a kind nurse, but the future of humanity itself. The future was uncertain, the path dangerous. But for the first time since she'd boarded that private jet what felt like a lifetime ago, Sarah Connor knew exactly who she was and what she was meant to do. If this story touched something in you, perhaps you too are part of something larger than yourself, something waiting to be awakened. Remember to like and subscribe for more stories that blur the line between science fiction and the secrets written in our very DNA. The truth, after all, is often stranger and more beautiful than fiction.